So let's go to the big names in the global energy sector, which converged in Nairobi a week ago for the 2023 Africa Energy Forum Summit. The hundreds of delegates across energy companies, policymakers, investors, and others spent those 3 days deliberating on the key issues of energy on the African continent. Wonodi is the founder and CEO at ZKJ Energy. He was at the African Energy Forum Conference in Nairobi, Kenya. And he joined me now from our Abuja studios for a chat to the conference. Wonodi was also the pioneer CEO of the Nigerian Bulk Electricity Trading Company, or NBET. Thanks for making it here tonight, sir. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
We appreciate it. Thank you so much for making the time. When we talk about a big energy forum such as the AEF, which was recently held in Nairobi, tell me about it. What are the main highlights of this major summit for 3 days for you?
So, Bosin, again, thank you for having me. When it comes to global energy discussions and forums like this, you know, what keeps being dominant is the energy transition discussion. And from the forum, what you could see is that the African countries are making a stand and saying that what is important and what is critical to Africa right now is energy access and not the transition. Because first and foremost, you have to transition from something to another. And to the extent that many Africans do not have access to electricity, the more critical thing is how to get people connected to some form of electricity. And where it then has a handshake with energy transition, then very well. And so the energy transition debate will push more renewables into the energy mix. And for most African countries, that works for mini grids, for places that are far-flung from the grid. But, you know, for renewable energy, because of intermittency problems, it's very difficult for them to form a base load. And therefore, countries like Nigeria that have gas have chosen to stick by gas as a transition fuel. So generally, that's primarily what the most of the discussions are all about. Energy transition, just energy transition. So it's got to be fair, it's got to be equitable, and it's got to work for every country that is participating in that.
Well, are there new thinking and approach to sustainable energy for Africa that the summit was able to advance in terms of whether the big companies that are in the business of electricity generation, globally speaking, you know all the big names as it were, you spent many years in the industry as well, you're the pioneer CEO of NBET, so I'm sure you know. Are there new thinking, new approach that we're bringing to the table to provide sustainable energy for 1.2 billion people on the continent?
So this is exactly what I was saying. Sustainable energy, there's a big role for renewable energies because, like we say, first you have to have access, and then there is a need to strengthen the grids, you know, so that grids can do both these conventional power coming from gas, coming from big hydro, coming from coal, but at the same time, sustainable energy means that countries have to work towards making their grid stable enough for renewable energy. And Kenya has done a very great job with that. That's what we've seen. Kenya has integrated a lot of RE in its energy mix and is doing very well.
But why had basic electricity or power become such a difficult thing for some of other African, sub-Saharan Africa, resource-based economies such as Nigeria? We'll talk about South Africa a little bit later. But let's talk about Nigeria, for example. We've got various sources of energy, but having it on a sustainable basis, access still remains a very big issue. The World Bank is looking at additional $750 million support for the country's electrification.
Well, I think that for resource-based country, what you generally see is there's a tendency to fall towards subsidy because you think that you have gas resources, you don't want to price it at the market price, and because you have a lot of energy potential, then you do not price it at market, and then you have tariffs that are subsidized or pushed down. So So you see that in Nigeria, it's same thing with fuel subsidies, and it's the same thing that you're having in electricity, where some folks actually feel that the government should just put a cap on the price of gas, for instance. So what, in essence, is that resource-rich countries tend to fall towards subsidies and then low tariffs. That is one. On the other hand is the issue of not making the adequate investment that are required for the network, and then, of course, the issue of stable policy, macro environment that attracts investment. So you said we'll talk about South Africa, but South Africa is a good example of where things could go wrong when you don't do the right things, especially when it concerns investment.
Yes, so South Africa has been a poster boy for sustainable energy, which powers its industrialization, whether you talk about mining or industrial manufacturing, tourism, as it were, over years and decades now. South Africa is buckling on the knees as far as Eskom utility is concerned. I'm sure this must be part of the conversations in Nairobi. What lessons are there in terms of the mess that Eskom is right now, and for this Africa's poster boy of economic development that South Africa had always been?
Well, I think that the truth is that South Africa failed to make the investments that are required. So they have all these fleet of coal power plants that somewhere along the line required investment to upgrade them, or maybe retire them and build new ones. But it's difficult to build new ones when the whole world is saying move away from coal. So I think to a large extent they were just stuck in between what to do. But the good news, and then of course there's the issue of corruption and low tariffs. But the good news, and what we're hearing, is that South Africa has become very aggressive when it comes to renewable. So they just concluded the 6th round of renewable, and from there they're getting prices as low as 3 cents per kilowatt hour, right? And this is when they started about 2011. The clearing prices were about 35 cents. So they've done very well over the period of 12 years. And but the thing is that it's just recently they've become aggressive with the capacity they're procuring. And then, of course, like they say, they know that they need to do a lot of work towards, making the grid stable enough to accept all this capacity that they've procured. And they're procuring both solar, and they're procuring winds, and they're concentrated solar projects. So you never can tell. It's a poster boy of things gone wrong, but it might also end up being the poster boy of how to, correct for the wrongs of the past.
Okay, but what are the lessons for Nigeria here? What are the implications for Nigeria's consumers? The country is moving towards a floating exchange rate. Do you think we're going to have electricity tariff in Nigeria revised upwards? How do you think that will work?
Well, it's not a very palatable news, but you have a depressed tariff that has, at the end of the day, not giving us any extra electricity. So is that it? But I don't think it's all about tariff. It's also the climate for investment. You have to have a stable policy. You have to have one exchange rate window, which everybody wants. But what it means is that the prices of electricity and other subsidies, other key productivity inputs will go up, right? So in the short term, it's going to be quite some pain. But if you're floating the exchange rate and at the same time saying that you want to move away from subsidies, then there is no other way but the prices will go up. Now, what we need to do is to use regulation and put it in such a way that actually the market works for the consumers. We've talked about making sure that power shows up when people need it, so that there's some predictability that allows people to rely on power coming from the grid. It's painful to pay high prices, high tariffs for grid power, and then at the same time, you still have to rely on alternative generation sources like fuel generators or diesel generators. So that wouldn't work. So we need to have regulation that allows and make sure that what comes to the grid actually works for people, is predictable, is reliable. And this is one of the things to take away from Kenya. So in Kenya, they have time of use pricing for electricity, and that way they're managing both supply and demand characteristics so that people actually align the best way for this to work for them. The tariffs are not cheaper than Nigeria. They're actually more expensive, but the thing is that Kenyans can actually depend on grid electricity. They can find it predictable, and that's what we need to do in Nigeria. But will the prices go up? They will go up, but we also hope that it catalyzes the investment that is required to actually expand and move from this 5,000 to 12,000, 15, 20,000 in the short medium term.
Okay, so my final point in this conversation is the Electricity Act, which was signed. Is that a silver bullet for the Nigeria's struggling energy sector? What's your take?
Bosin, we're going to find this silver bullet one day, but I think that it's progress, right? But it needs to be managed because, and thankfully the regulator is now trying to have a forum where stakeholders can talk about who does what, because what it says now is that states can regulate distribution, generation, and transmission just as the federal, right? But we need to be sure who does what so that investors do not end up confused about who to actually, which of the regulators or regulations that you have to comply with. Secondly, multiple regulators could mean higher tariffs for consumers. So we want to be sure that it is streamlined in such a way that the positive part of it remains and the negatives are trimmed and kept to the barest minimum. So it's a great development, but it's important that it is managed and that states have their own turf and then the federal, and then we can see what is in between that. But yeah, it's a great start, but the conversations and work needs to be done in the short order to make it work.
It's a work in progress, but at least a shot has been fired, whether the bullet is silver or whatever color it is. We'll find that silver bullet one day for the energy sector, not just in Nigeria, I'm sure across a number of frontier African markets. Thank you so much. Have a great evening, and we appreciate those perspectives on the continent's energy sector. Wonodi, pioneer CEO of NBET, and now the founder and CEO of ZKJ Energy.